Teresa Coenen with Stitchin, and today I'm going to show you how to do block 12 of our parable series. Block 12 finishes at 4 inches, and it's for the parable Weeds Among Good Plants. Let's get started.
Let us pray. Great and merciful Father, you are the sower and I am your seed. Let me fall on the path of righteousness and bear fruits that give you glory. Even when evil corrupts me and I become a weed in your garden, you find something worthy in me and save me from the compost heap. I commit my seed into your hands. Sow me as you will. Amen.
Let's take a look at the pattern. Block 12, Weeds Among Good Plants, finishes at 4 inches. On the first page of the pattern, I have a picture of the block, your cutting instructions, the parable, and then a reflection on the parable, including a prayer at the bottom. Page 2 of the pattern includes your instructions to complete the block, including trimming and pressing. I also include the unfinished unit size of each step of the block. Make sure you're measuring your block as you move along. Page 3 includes the image of the block, why I chose this particular block to represent the weeds among good plants, and space for your own personal reflection. Let's take a look at fabric choices. It's a very small block, so you're going to want to make sure that you're choosing fabrics that read as a solid, simply because you don't have a lot of room for a large print to go in these half squares. I'm doing my quilt in 2 different colorways. In the one, I already have my block complete, and I chose to use the same background that I'm using in all my other blocks. I thought this looked like a thistle, so I chose a fabric to me that represented a thistle. And the block has a part where there is evil that makes this a weed and not a flower. So I chose a fabric here that I thought could represent evil. In my second fabric, I choose a light nondescript background. And again, my flower itself is in a fabric that's just got tone on tone and can read as a solid from a distance. And for the evil that makes this a weed, I've chosen this gray. You don't need a very large piece, so you just have to think in terms of how that would look in the corner of that flower unit. Again, this would not be a fabric that you want to use a large or even a medium scale print, because it's going to be too large of a print to have in these little half square units. In the other quilt that I'm making, I have a small scale nondescript background fabric. I've got some yellow dots here. For my thistle, for my weed, I've chosen this particular fabric here, and you do not have to choose purple, but it just happens to work out in both of my quilts. And to represent evil, I have chosen this fabric here. Again, you're going to want to use a small scale print or a tone on tone fabric, so that when you get into these little half squares, you don't have to worry about the print taking away from your half square units. If I didn't want to use purple, for example, and wanted to use maybe a print that had more flowers in it, I might choose a very small scale print, and again, put my evil down in the corner. You're going to be using very small pieces of this fabric. So if your fabric has wrinkles in it, make sure you have it pressed nice and flat before you begin cutting. There's really not a lot of room in those tiny blocks. Before you cut, you want to make sure you trim your selvage off the edge first, so you're not dealing with selvage in your actual quilt. You can layer your background and your thistle fabrics on top of each other, because you need the same 1.5 inch squares of both of those. You're going to need 7 of your background and 6 of your thistle fabric. Once I've made that initial cut, I just turn it and make my subcuts, making sure with my ruler that I'm straight on 3 sides, so that I know that 4th side cut is straight as well. From the thistle fabric, you're also going to need a 2.5 inch square and 2 1.5 by 2.5 inch pieces. So I'm going to cut a small 2.5 inch strip here and cut my units from that. Again, I'm making sure when I cut that I'm square on 3 edges. That way I know my 4th edge will give me a nice square unit. And the last piece that I need to cut is the 1.5 inch square for evil. But once I have all my pieces, I'm ready to construct my block. Step 1 of the pattern is when we're going to make our half square units. And we're going to use the cheater method where we place 2 squares on top of each other and stitch diagonally. This is because it's such a small unit, it's hard to cut triangles for this. The pattern calls for you to mark the diagonal on the wrong side of the fabric, and you would do that using a ruler and a pencil or chalk so you can see where to sew. Or the method I like to use is the pressing method, where I fold it over with wrong sides together and set the iron in place. That way I can use the press line as my sewing line. One of the reasons why I like to use the press method is because it also will indicate to me if I happen to have cut one of these units not square. Because when I fold it over, it should make a perfect triangle. Whereas when I'm marking the units, I'm marking from corner to corner. So if I did not cut this square, I would not necessarily know that. So you'll go ahead and you'll either mark or press your units. Place 2 units together with right sides together. Stitch diagonally. And I'm going to chain piece those from my machine. So with right sides together, I can see my line that I need to stitch on, and I'll just stitch diagonally from corner to corner. So I have my chain of my half squares. To take my chain apart, I like to use a chain ripper, which is just a seam ripper that sets in a base. So I can just pop that chain apart. Now the pattern calls for you to trim 1/4 inch outside that seam. And you can do that by just using a pair of scissors, but I really recommend, in order for you to have a nice crisp seam and cut, I recommend that you use a ruler, and I like to use a ruler that has a nice defined 1/4 inch. This one happens to be a Marty Michelle square up tool. And then I'll just trim those units off at 1/4 inch. Then we're going to press them open. The pattern calls for you to press the seam open. We're doing that to reduce bulk. Oftentimes you would press a half square one direction or the other, but because we have half squares going in 2 different directions, we have to work on reducing bulk. So to press the seam open, I just lay it flat and I'll finger press that seam first. Then set a hot iron in place for 5 seconds. The pattern tells you that the unfinished unit should measure 1.5 inch square. So I measure each one to make sure that they do before I move on. If they don't measure exactly 1.5 inches square, it's time to make an adjustment before you make the mistake and try to force that into your quilt. It's a very small block, so we don't have a lot of room for error here. Step 2 and step 3 of the pattern are very similar. In step 2 of the pattern, we use the large square and the rectangle. Flip it over like a sandwich and stitch at 1/4 inch. In step 2, the pattern calls for you to press to the outside. So I'll set the seam in place, flip it open, and press to the outside. Again, just holding my iron in place for 5 seconds. In step 3, I'm adding the piece that's evil to the rest of the block. So I make sure I turn that the direction I want it to go, flip it over like a sandwich, and stitch it 1/4 inch. In step 3, we're to press this unit to the inside. So I take my inside fabric and put it on top, set the seam, open, and hold my iron in place for 5 seconds. This is a small unit, so it's fairly easy to press it straight. But if this was a larger unit, you'd want to make sure that you're working hard to make sure that your unit is nice and horizontally straight as you're pressing. In step 4, you're going to take the unit from step 3 and step 2, put them together, matching that seam and nesting the seam. You can pin. I like to put my pin in the uphill side of the seam allowance and making sure that both edges are even. In step 4, we're to press it to the bottom. So with my bottom fabric up, I'll set the seam, turn, and press, holding that seam in place for 5 seconds. The unfinished unit should measure a 3.5-inch square, and I measure it to make sure that I have the right measurement before I move on. Step 5 of the pattern calls for you to take 3 half squares and place them in order vertically. It's really important to pay attention to the pattern on the image because the left side of this flower, this thistle, if you will, the half squares go one direction, and on the right side, the half squares go the other direction. You have left and right facing half squares. So make sure you pay attention to the image shown on the left as you put these together. Stitch them at 1/4 inch. You have no seams to match. You're just going to make sure that the edges of the unit are nice and square. The pattern calls for you to press towards your background triangles. So when I turn it over, I can press towards the background, just as so. In order to do this and keep the unit straight, I first make it straight on my mat. I get my iron in place, and I use my fingers to stretch out the fabric and make sure I have it nice and taut. And you can see that I have the unit on my mat nice and straight. So I have a nice horizontal row. So now I can just set the iron in place, and I'll go a long 5 seconds because these got some awkward, bulky diagonal seams. And the importance is to keep it nice and straight on all edges. So there's my unit. The pattern calls for it to measure 1.5 by 3.5, and I'll measure it before I move on. In step 6, we're going to take this half square vertical unit from step 5 and stitch it to the side of the unit from step 4. I'll fold this over like a sandwich, and I'm going to nest those seams. This is where a pin is going to come in very handy, and I'm going to make sure I pin it on the uphill side of the seam, in the seam allowance before the actual seam. I'll make sure that my edges of each block match up nicely, and I'll place another pin in place if I need to. I'll stitch it 1/4 inch. Now that I have that stitched in place, the pattern calls for you to press to the inside of the unit. So I'll flip my unit over so that the inside is on top, use my iron to set the seam, and then open the unit and press, holding my iron in place for a good 5 seconds. The pattern calls that the unfinished unit should measure 3.5 inches by 4.5. So I measure before moving on to the next step. Step 7 of the pattern calls for you to take 3 half square units and a background piece and stitch them together in a horizontal row. Again, make sure that you have your points going the right direction because we had a couple quilters that made the mistake of turning it the wrong direction, and then it's not going to be correct on your actual block. So again, you'll fold those over like a sandwich, stitch 1/4 inch, making sure that you keep the edges of the block units lined up. Once I have the units stitched together, the pattern calls for you to press them towards the background fabric. So again, I'll turn that unit over, set my iron on the first half square, and use my hands to pull this out and make sure that it remains nice and square on all edges. And I'll just slide the iron over onto each one of these seams individually. And once I have that pressed, I'll flip it over, take a look, and that looks good. The pattern calls for this unit to measure 1.5 by 4.5 inches. So I measure it to make sure that I'm nice and even with all my measurements before I move on to the next step. Step 8 calls for you to take your unit from step 7 and stitch it to the top of the block from step 6. I'm going to fold it over like a sandwich, and I'm nesting that seam here and a seam here. So again, I can place a pin in the uphill side of that seam in the seam allowance, and I'll make sure that the edges of the block unit are also even before I stitch 1/4 inch. Pattern calls for this unit to be pressed towards the inside. So I'll turn the unit over so the inside is facing up, and I'll set the seam. And I know that that means I'll have extra bulk here in this corner, but that's better than having extra bulk on those half squares. So I set the seam in place, turn the block open, and set my iron in place. Once I've done that, I'll flip it over and press it again to make sure I have a nice good press before moving forward with measuring. The block is to measure 4.5 inches square. So I measure it to make sure that I'm square on all edges. And then I'm going to go ahead and stitch 1/8 inch around these edges, particularly because I have these half squares, but to keep my block nice and square as I move it along during my block of the month. So now you can see I've stitched that 1/8 inch around the edge of my block unit so it stays nice and square. It's ready to go to the design wall. And there you have Block 12, Weeds Among Good Plants from our Parables series. If you have any questions along the way, give me a call, send an email, or send a text message. Someone will get back to you right away. Thank you and have a blessed day.